Matthias leaned against the counter of the small, dimly lit diner, watching as the woman in front of him wrapped sandwiches with quick, practiced movements. Dahlia had no idea who he really was, and that was exactly how he wanted it. "Order up," Dahlia called, sliding the brown paper bag across the counter with a tired but genuine smile. "That'll be $10. Matthias reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against the crisp bills he rarely carried. It felt foreign to him handling small cash when he could buy out the entire block without blinking. But tonight, he was just another struggling man trying to make ends meet. "Thanks," he said, handing her the money. Dahlia tilted her head, observing him with a curious expression. "You're new around here, aren't you?" "Yeah," Matthias nodded. "Just moved to town." "Looking for work," she sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "Tough luck, jobs don't come easy in this part of the city." Matthias already knew that. He had spent the past 2 weeks pretending to be broke, taking odd jobs at construction sites, eating at local diners like this one, and living in a run-down apartment he had rented just for this ridiculous test. A test, that's what this was. He had been burned before too many women had seen him for his wealth, not for the man beneath it. So he had decided to strip it all away. If a woman could love him at his lowest, only then would he trust her with his heart. Dahlia seemed different. She wasn't flashy, wasn't looking for an easy way out. She worked hard, and from what he had overheard from the other customers, she had been doing it alone for years. No family, no backup plan, just grit and determination. "Well," she said, leaning on the counter, "if you're looking for work, the diner could use an extra set of hands. The pay's not great, but it's something." Matthias blinked. He had expected kind words, maybe some small talk, but an actual job offer? No one had ever handed him opportunity without knowing who he was. "You serious?" he asked. Dahlia shrugged. "You look like you could use a break, and we're short-staffed, so it works out." For the first time in a long time, Matthias let out a real, unguarded laugh. "All right," he said, "I'll take it." And just like that, the billionaire CEO of Magnus Enterprises became a dishwasher at a struggling corner diner. The days passed, turning into weeks. Matthias worked alongside Dahlia, scrubbing dishes, wiping down tables, and listening to her hum softly as she refilled coffee cups. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. She never complained, never asked for more than what she had. Even when the bills piled up, even when exhaustion weighed heavy on her shoulders, she kept going. "You're really bad at this," Dahlia teased one evening, watching as Matthias clumsily attempted to balance a tray of drinks. "Give me a break," he muttered, barely catching a falling glass. She laughed, a sound so warm, so unfiltered, that it sent an unexpected ache through his chest. "You're lucky you've got good looks, because you wouldn't survive a week in the food industry," she said playfully. Matthias grinned. "I'll take that as a compliment." Dahlia shook her head, but there was something in her eyes, something soft, and that was when he knew. He was falling for her, and she had no idea who he really was. Matthias stood beside the grill, flipping burgers with a skill that had only mildly improved since Dahlia had taken him on. The heat from the kitchen was stifling, the scent of sizzling meat clinging to his clothes, but none of it mattered. Not when Dahlia was just a few feet away, rolling dough for the morning's pastries, her forehead streaked with flour, her lips pursed in concentration. He'd learned more about her in the past few weeks than he had about most people in his entire life. She had a habit of tapping her fingers against the counter when she was deep in thought. She always gave the last slice of pie to the customers who looked like they needed it most. And she never, ever let anyone see her struggle, even when the exhaustion in her eyes told him she was barely holding it together. But what struck him the most was the way she treated him, not as a man who was down on his luck, not with pity or suspicion, but as an equal. She teased him mercilessly when he messed up orders, nudged his shoulder when he got too serious, and on the rare occasion when she let her guard down, told him bits and pieces of her life as if she trusted him to keep them safe. Tonight, the diner was quiet, the usual late-night rush reduced to a few stragglers nursing cups of coffee. Dahlia wiped down the counter, glancing at him with a thoughtful expression. "You ever think about what you'd do if you weren't stuck working jobs like this?" she asked. Matthias hesitated, gripping the edge of the counter. "What do you mean?" she shrugged. "You're smart." "I can tell, and you don't seem like the kind of guy who grew up flipping burgers. So what's the dream?" The dream. The empire he had built from the ground up. The boardrooms, the private jets, the power that came with being one of the most influential men in the city. He had spent years chasing success, yet now, standing in this tiny diner, watching Dahlia talk about dreams as if they were something tangible, he felt strangely unmoored. "I don't know," he lied. Dahlia sighed, shaking her head. "That's a shame. You gotta have something to work toward, or else what's the point?" Her words settled deep in his chest, an uncomfortable truth he wasn't ready to face. Before he could respond, the door swung open, and a man in a stiff suit strode in, his eyes sweeping over the diner like he was stepping into a foreign land. Matthias tensed immediately. He recognized the man Gerald, one of his senior executives. Gerald's gaze landed on him, and for a moment, his carefully crafted disguise threatened to crumble. "Matthias," Gerald said, his voice laced with disbelief. "What the hell are you doing here?" Dahlia frowned, looking between them. "You two know each other." Matthias forced himself to keep his expression neutral. "No," he said quickly. "You must have me confused with someone else." Gerald's brows furrowed, but to his credit, he didn't push. Instead, he gave Matthias a pointed look before turning to Dahlia. "Coffee, black." As she moved to fill the order, Matthias stepped closer to Gerald, lowering his voice. "What are you doing here?" Gerald scoffed. "Looking for you, obviously. You disappeared. The board is on edge. Investors are asking questions. I told you I needed time," Matthias interrupted, his tone sharp. "Time for what? Playing house in some run-down diner?" Gerald's voice dripped with disdain. "This is ridiculous, Matthias. You have an empire to run, and you're out here pretending to be broke." Matthias clenched his jaw. "I told you I needed to see if a woman can love you without knowing you're rich," Gerald scoffed. "This is insane." Matthias didn't respond. He couldn't. Because deep down, he knew Gerald wasn't entirely wrong. Dahlia returned with the coffee, placing it in front of Gerald with a polite nod. "Here you go." Gerald barely acknowledged her, his attention fixed on Matthias. "You need to come back. This charade has gone on long enough," Matthias exhaled slowly. "Not yet." Gerald's expression darkened. "Fine, but don't expect the world to wait for you forever." With that, he tossed a bill onto the counter and walked out, leaving an uneasy silence in his wake. Dahlia crossed her arms, eyeing Matthias carefully. "So, are you going to tell me what that was about?" He hesitated, the weight of his deception pressing down on him. "Just an old friend," he finally said. Dahlia didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. Instead, she let out a tired sigh and rubbed her temples. "Well, whoever he is, he clearly thinks you belong somewhere else." Matthias swallowed hard, the truth of her words settling like a stone in his gut. He was running out of time. Matthias stood outside the diner after closing, the neon sign flickering above him. Dahlia was locking up, her fingers deftly turning the key in the rusted lock. The night air was thick with the scent of rain, the distant rumble of thunder warning of an impending storm. He should have left hours ago, but something in him refused to walk away. She turned to him, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "You've been quiet all night," she observed, her tone light but laced with curiosity. "That guy shook you up, huh?" Matthias exhaled, shoving his hands into the pockets of his worn-out jacket. "Something like that." Dahlia studied him, her eyes searching for something he wasn't sure he could give. "You don't have to tell me," she said, "but I think you want to." He did. More than anything, he wanted to rip off this disguise and tell her everything, that his name wasn't Matt, that he wasn't some struggling worker trying to make ends meet, that the man who had walked into the diner earlier had been his right-hand executive, not some old friend. But the words lodged in his throat, trapped by the very test he had set for himself. Instead, he deflected. "What about you?" he asked. "Ever think about leaving this place?" Dahlia let out a small chuckle, but there was no real humor in it. "Where would I go?" "Anywhere." "Everywhere," she shook her head, leaning against the brick wall. "I used to dream about that, back when I thought life would turn out differently. But dreams don't keep the lights on." Her words settled heavily between them. Matthias had never known what it meant to struggle for survival, not really. Even when he had built his company from the ground up, he had never worried about where his next meal would come from or if he could afford to pay rent. Dahlia had lived that reality every single day. Before he could say anything else, the first drops of rain began to fall. Dahlia tilted her face upward, letting the cool water hit her skin. "You should head home," she said. "Storm's coming." Matthias hesitated. "Let me walk you." She glanced at him, a flicker of surprise in her expression. "You don't have to do that." "I want to." Dahlia hesitated for only a moment before nodding. They started down the street together, the rain intensifying around them. By the time they reached the worn-down apartment complex where she lived, they were both soaked. She stood on the first step, looking down at him. "Thanks," she said softly. Matthias' pulse pounded in his ears. He knew he was dangerously close to crossing a line he couldn't undo. But then Dahlia did something unexpected. She reached out, brushing a damp strand of hair away from his forehead. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a current through him stronger than any storm. She pulled her hand back quickly, as if realizing what she had done. "Good night, Matt." And then she was gone, disappearing behind the door before he could respond. Matthias stood there for a long moment, rain dripping from his hair, his clothes clinging to his skin. He was in trouble. Deep, undeniable trouble. The next day, Matthias arrived at the diner early, but Dahlia wasn't there. Instead, an older woman, one of the part-time workers, was refilling the sugar dispensers. "She's out running errands," the woman said when he asked. "She mentioned something about the landlord." Matthias frowned. He had never heard Dahlia mention any issues with her apartment, but then again, she wasn't exactly the type to complain. A nagging feeling settled in his gut. Without overthinking it, he left the diner and made his way toward her building. When he arrived, he found Dahlia standing outside, her arms crossed as she argued with a man who looked like he hadn't done an honest day's work in years. "You have until the end of the week, Dahlia," the man said, his voice sharp. "I can't keep waiting." "I just need a little more time," she replied. The landlord scoffed. "You've been saying that for months. Either you pay up or you find somewhere else to go." Matthias stepped forward before he could stop himself. "What's going on?" Dahlia turned abruptly, her expression shifting from worry to forced calm. "It's nothing," she said quickly. The landlord eyed Matthias with disinterest. "Who's this?" "A friend," Matthias said, his tone hard. The man snorted. "Well, unless your friend has a few $1,000s lying around, it doesn't matter. Pay by the end of the week or you're out." With that, he walked off, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Dahlia exhaled, running a hand over her face. "You didn't have to see that." Matthias ignored the comment. "How much do you owe?" She stiffened. "It's not your problem. It is if you're about to lose your home." Dahlia shook her head. "I'll figure it out." Matthias felt frustration coil in his chest. She was too proud, too stubborn. He could fix this in an instant, one call, one transaction, and she'd never have to worry about rent again. But he couldn't do that, not without revealing everything. Instead, he made a decision. "If you need extra money, let me help." She frowned. "Help how?" "I'll take on more shifts. You can cut back on yours and pick up another job if you need to." Dahlia stared at him. "You do that?" In a heartbeat. Something in her expression softened. "I can't ask you to do that. You didn't ask." "I'm offering." For a moment, she looked like she might refuse, but then she let out a breath. "All right." but only for a little while. Matthias nodded, but deep down, he knew he would do whatever it took to keep her safe, even if it meant risking everything. Matthias sat at the diner's back booth, hands clasped together as he stared at the empty coffee cup in front of him. Dahlia was working the late shift, weaving between tables with effortless grace, but something was off. He could see it in the way she carried herself, in the faint tension in her shoulders. She was exhausted, and despite her insistence that she would figure things out on her own, he knew she was barely keeping it together. The weight of his deception pressed against his chest. Every moment he spent with her, every stolen glance, every lingering brush of fingers, made it harder to keep the truth from tumbling out. He had been so sure that this test was necessary that he needed to strip away his wealth to find something real. But now, all he could think about was how much it would hurt her when she found out. He couldn't let her struggle anymore. As she passed by his booth, he reached out, gently wrapping his fingers around her wrist. She stopped mid-step, looking down at him in surprise. "Come with me," he said, his voice low. Dahlia hesitated, glancing around at the half-empty diner. "Matthias, I'm working, just for a minute." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because she sighed and slid into the booth across from him. "What's going on?" Matthias took a deep breath. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen until I'm done." She frowned, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "Okay." The words felt heavy, almost impossible to push past his lips, but he forced himself to say them. "I haven't been honest with you." Dahlia's eyes darkened with something unreadable, but she didn't speak. "I came here under false pretenses. I told you I was just another guy looking for work, but that's not the truth." He swallowed hard. "The truth is, I'm the CEO of Magnus Enterprises. I run one of the largest corporations in the city. I have more money than I could ever spend in a lifetime." Dahlia's expression didn't change, not at first, but then her lips parted slightly, her breath catching. He kept going, unable to stop. "I didn't want anyone to know who I was. I've been burned before people only seeing me for my wealth, not for the man I am underneath it. So I left everything behind. I wanted to see if someone could love me for me," his voice lowered. "If you could." The silence between them was deafening. Dahlia stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she stood. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "I need a minute," she whispered, and then she walked out. Matthias sat frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had expected anger, shock, maybe even betrayal, but the way she had looked at him, as if she didn't know him at all, it was worse than anything he could have imagined. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then, unable to bear it any longer, he pushed himself up and followed her outside. She stood beneath a street lamp, arms wrapped around herself as the cold air swirled around them. When he approached, she didn't turn. "I never cared about money," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "You know that, right?" "I know," he said. "That's why she shook her head, finally looking at him. "Then why didn't you trust me?" His chest tightened. "It wasn't about trust, it was about fear. I was terrified that if I told you the truth, you'd see me differently." Dahlia let out a bitter laugh. "And now," Matthias took a step closer, "now I just want you to know that none of it mattered. Not the test, not the money. The only thing that mattered was you." Her eyes searched his, and for the first time he saw the hurt he had caused her. But beneath it, there was something else, something that made hope flare in his chest. "I don't know if I can just pretend this never happened," she admitted. "I don't want you to." Matthias reached for her hand again, and this time she didn't pull away. "I just want a chance to prove that I love you. No games, no lies. Just us." Dahlia inhaled sharply, and for a moment he thought she would walk away, but then she exhaled and squeezed his fingers. "You already have," she whispered. Matthias didn't hesitate. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he never intended to let go. And this time, he wouldn't. Matthias had never experienced silence quite like this one. It wasn't the cold, distant silence of boardrooms filled with skeptical investors or the hollow quiet of his penthouse at night. This was different. This was Dahlia standing next to him, her fingers still lightly curled around his, her breathing measured, her mind racing with thoughts she hadn't yet voiced. He didn't dare speak first. He had already taken so much from her, the illusion of who he was, the trust she had placed in him. Now, it had to be her choice whether she stayed or walked away. The street lamp above them flickered slightly, casting faint shadows across her face. She was studying him with an intensity that made the air between them thick with unspoken words. Finally, she exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to move past this." Matthias' chest tightened. "Tell me what you need," he said. "Anything?" Dahlia closed her eyes for a brief second, then reopened them. "I need to know that this isn't a game to you. That I wasn't just some experiment." His grip on her hand tightened slightly. "You weren't, you never were. I thought I was testing the world, but the truth is I was the one being tested." He looked at her, pleading silently for her to believe him, "and I failed." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she released a slow breath, her gaze flickering toward the distant city skyline. "You know what hurts the most," she finally said. "You didn't trust me enough to let me make my own choices. You decided for me that I wouldn't want the truth." Matthias swallowed hard. He had built his life on control, meticulously crafting every outcome before it could spiral into chaos. But with Dahlia, there had never been control, only the raw, unpredictable force of something real. "I see that now," he admitted. "And I hate that I hurt you." Dahlia turned back to him, searching his face for something he wasn't sure he could give: forgiveness, reassurance. Proof that this, whatever this was, could still be salvaged. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke again. "I don't want grand gestures, Matthias. I don't want expensive gifts or fancy promises. I just want honesty." Matthias nodded, his throat tight. "Then that's what you'll get. From now on." She studied him for another long moment before finally she nodded. "Okay." A breath he hadn't realized he was holding escaped him. It wasn't everything, but it was something. It was a beginning. The next few days passed in a blur of cautious steps forward. Dahlia didn't leave him, but she didn't fall back into easy laughter and teasing remarks either. Their conversations were careful, measured, like they were both trying to find their footing on unfamiliar ground. Matthias had never felt more uncertain in his life. He could close billion-dollar deals with a single phone call, navigate corporate warfare without breaking stride. But this winning back the trust of the one woman who had ever truly seen him was the hardest thing he had ever done. One evening, as the diner's last customers filtered out, Dahlia wiped down the counter, her movements slower than usual. Matthias watched her, resisting the urge to reach for her, to pull her into the safety of his arms. "I'm leaving the diner," he said suddenly. She froze, the cloth in her hand stilling against the countertop. "What?" "I don't belong here, Dahlia," he hesitated. "And neither do you." Her eyebrows pulled together, her expression unreadable. "What are you saying?" Matthias took a cautious step closer. "I know how hard you've fought to keep this place running, but you deserve more. You deserve to chase the dreams you gave up on. Not because I want you to, but because you should want that for yourself." Dahlia looked away, her jaw tightening. "Dreams don't pay bills, Matthias. That's where you're wrong." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the counter toward her. She hesitated before picking it up. As her eyes scanned the details, her lips parted slightly in shock. "This is a deed," he confirmed, "to the building." "Your building?" Her fingers tightened around the paper. "Matthias, I can't." "Yes, you can," he interrupted, "because this place means something to you. And because no one should have the power to take it away from you." Dahlia shook her head, struggling to process what was happening. "This is too much." "No," Matthias said softly. "Losing you would be too much." She looked up at him then, something raw and vulnerable in her eyes. "You're serious?" "Completely." A slow breath escaped her, and for the first time in days he saw something shift in her expression, relief, hope, maybe even something more. Then slowly she placed the deed back on the counter and stepped around it, closing the distance between them. "You're still an idiot," she murmured. Matthias let out a soft chuckle. "I know." And then, finally, after everything, she reached for him. When their lips met, it wasn't rushed or desperate. It was steady, certain, a promise. Matthias wrapped his arms around her, holding her close like she was the only thing in his world that mattered, because she was. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't pretending. Matthias stood in the center of the diner, watching as Dahlia ran her fingers over the deed he had given her. The weight of what he had done still lingered between them, but this time, it wasn't uncertainty that filled the space, it was something new. Something unspoken but deeply understood. Dahlia set the paper down on the counter, her fingers lingering on the edges before she looked up at him. Her eyes were softer now, but there was still a lingering trace of hesitation, as if she were waiting for the world to prove her wrong. Matthias had no intention of letting that happen. The diner door swung open, and a gust of cool evening air swept in. Gerald stepped inside, his sharp gaze immediately locking onto Matthias. The interruption was unwelcome, but Matthias had expected it. Matthias squared his shoulders as Gerald approached. Dahlia remained silent, watching the exchange with quiet curiosity. Gerald didn't waste any time. "The board is restless," he said, his tone clipped. "They want answers, you can't keep ignoring them." Matthias exhaled slowly. He had built Magnus Enterprises from nothing, but for the first time, the weight of it felt insignificant compared to what stood in front of him. Dahlia listened without speaking, her expression unreadable. "I'm not ignoring them," Matthias finally answered, "but I'm not returning to business as usual either." Gerald's jaw tightened. "Matthias, this company is your life." "No," Matthias interrupted. "It was my life. And I'll always care about it, but I've spent too many years chasing something that never truly satisfied me." His gaze flickered toward Dahlia. "That changes now." A flicker of understanding crossed Gerald's face, but it was quickly masked by frustration. "You're willing to risk everything for this?" Matthias didn't hesitate. "Yes," Gerald sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Then I hope you know what you're doing." "I do." With that, Gerald stepped back, nodding once before turning toward the door. As he left, the tension in the room dissipated, leaving only Matthias and Dahlia in the quiet space. Dahlia's arms were crossed, her brow furrowed. "You're really walking away from it all?" Matthias shook his head. "Not walking away, changing course." She tilted her head slightly, waiting for him to elaborate. "I don't want to spend my life chasing something that doesn't make me happy," he admitted. "I still have responsibilities, but I can redefine what success looks like. And I want that future to have you in it." Dahlia blinked, as if the weight of his words was settling in. "That's a lot to promise." Matthias stepped closer, his voice unwavering. "It's not a promise, it's a choice, and I'm making it." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Dahlia reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "You don't have to prove anything to me, Matthias," she said softly. "I just need to know that when you say these things, you mean them." Matthias lifted their joined hands, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I mean every single word." Dahlia let out a slow breath, nodding once. "Then I guess we figure this out together." Matthias smiled, warmth spreading through him. Together. Outside, the city hummed with life, but in that moment, nothing else mattered. Matthias had spent his life building an empire, but he hadn't truly lived until now. And with Dahlia by his side, he finally understood what it meant to have everything.